Okay, so there's this recent Brax video, and there's also a Captain Cabinets video touting Chisa to be like the shorekeeper of negative statuses, and I think there's a lot more to it that's not being discussed and information that's needed to see like the fuller picture. Chisa's kit reads as universal because Defense Shred is like a universal buff, and she has the max stack increase mechanic on her outro. First of all, I have to point out that out of the 2 negative status DPS that we have, one of them, Zani, does not care about the max stack increase mechanic at all. So there is precedent for the case where Kuro designs future negative status character kits that do not care about the mechanic either. Secondly, Cardathea is the other negative status DPS, and she needs this mechanic. That opens up another interpretation, actually, that it's possible that this was added to Chisa's kit just so that she could replace Arrow Rover here in order to sell a 5-star alternative to Rover, which then frees up the new element Rover to be used in a future team. Perhaps they're even going to be required in the same way Arrow Rover was needed by Cardathea, providing some like unique gimmick or something. So putting all of that together, it could be that this mechanic exists for Cardathea's benefit alone, and no other negative status character will care about that mechanic. If we're just looking at precedent, there's no guarantee that future negative status characters will care about this mechanic either. And I want to look at the negative statuses themselves because it looks like they might benefit from having 3 extra stacks, because they state that the damage increases based on the number of stacks, but that's if the focus on them is for the negative statuses themselves to do damage. So far with Spectrofragile and Air Erosion, again, the precedent has been that the status itself does not do damage, but rather just amplifies the damage multipliers of your DPS. Even Phoebe and Chacona, who buff the damage of Frazzle and Erosion, don't actually increase the status themselves in a meaningful way. Their buffs are there for DPS attacks that are coded as those damage types. If the precedent thus far has been that negative status damage itself is essentially negligible, then Chisa's max stack increase might not matter for this like number of stacks related to damage of the negative status. And then again, in addition to that, we don't know anything about the characters that will use these negative statuses. So we don't know how they'll be designed to utilize them, apply them. We don't know how much they'll apply. We don't know how they're going to be dealing damage. It's just stuff that we don't know yet. It doesn't exist in the game. There's been no hints of it yet. And when Spectrofragile and Air Erosion were updated, they also read very similarly to what we saw with these updates for the new negative statuses. You've got, for example, Spectrofragile deals spectro damage to the target at regular intervals during its duration. Specifically for Arrow Erosion, Arrow Erosion inflicts arrow damage on the target at regular intervals as long as it lasts, with more stacks resulting in greater damage, right? This reads very similarly to all of these Electrofusion Glacio updates, where the higher the stacks, the more damage is dealt, the higher the stacks, the more damage dealt. Electroflare, the higher the stacks, the more damage dealt. It's all the same, right? But with Arrow Erosion and Spectrofragile, their actual damage was meaningless. And that's what I mean by the precedent of the negative statuses. When we read these updates in the past without the context of Zani and Cardathea's kits for Frazzle and Erosion, there was, I think, an assumption that the statuses themselves might do damage because of the way that they read, right? But the reality that we got is that their multipliers are like pitifully low, and they just exist as a gimmick to juice an associated DPS. And they even read specifically the same way in regard to mentioning like how they do damage and having more stacks deals more damage. I just want to focus on this, like the idea that it feels eerily similar to what happened before, right? And so I don't think there's any surefire, without knowing the characters who will utilize these, there's not like a surefire way to state 100% that the statuses will be used to deal damage themselves and that the max stack increase will therefore matter without knowing how they're going to be utilized. And then for the Glacio, Fusion, and Electro statuses, they stack up to 10. And again, it just remains to be seen if 13 versus 10 will be a major difference. The reason that Arrow Rover had this max stack increase gimmick in the first place is because Arrow Erosion was arbitrarily set to have a max stacks of 3 so that they could code Cardathea's kit to require 6 stacks to reach maximum damage amplification, and thus you either need to pull multiple Cardathea copies or use the free Arrow Rover. And because it was free is not really an issue, but now you're looking at having to pull like an S1R1 Chisa for something like a 7% damage boost over Arrow Rover, right? And if we're just reading the negative statuses themselves, there could even be some anti-synergy with increasing the maximum stacks, because the terminology they're using is heavily reliant on this term maximum stack. Glacio, for example, only freezes the target at max stacks, as it says. So if you increase the max stack limit, you'd have to apply more stacks to achieve that effect, assuming that you'd want to freeze the target. Fusion and Electro statuses specifically state that they require the effect to be stacked to its max. again, the max stacks, with Fusion triggering the explosion at max, and then with Electro converting Electro Flare into Electro Rage at max stacks. If we take this terminology that they're using at face value, it would require that characters that apply it to then have even a more overabundance of the application to make up for the additional stacks they need to be applying to hit those effects. So if you wanted to trigger the damage effect or something, 2 to 3 times in a single rotation, you're looking at least like 6 to 9 more stacks that need to be applied to make that happen, which would also mean longer rotations, or it just adds more like nuance, I think, to the conversation with the negative statuses. So going back to the Shorekeeper moniker, we didn't get any sort of like Shorekeeper character in 2.x really at all. And I believe it's reasonable then to say that Kuro is leaning away from this kind of character design in favor of more niche teams, because they want you to pull for characters in pairs or in trios. For example, Augusta and Yuno had this little shield stacking gimmick created for them. So Yuno could have a portion of her buffs accessible only to herself and Augusta, and she could have been like a universal heavy attack support if like the entirety of her buffs in her kit were accessible to any like heavy attacker. Think about like Jian or Zani or something like that. But she just, for that, they just decided that that wasn't going to be the case. And so if the last Shorekeeper to come out was actually just Shorekeeper herself, and it was September 2024, which is over a year ago, it kind of counterbalances the whole idea that maybe they would be so excited to have another Shorekeeper character. And speaking of precedent as well, I kind of want to point out this character Silverwolf from Honkai Star Rail, which I know is a different game, but hear me out on this, right? So when she came out, she also had a universal functionality. She had this unique mechanic of a weakness implant, as well as the defense shred as well. Everyone was saying at the time that she's a must pull, she's future proof, right? But she very quickly became obsolete. Like in record-breaking fashion. I know this is an example from a different game, and it's HSR of all games, but I think the situation is so eerily similar to me that it started setting off like alarm bells in my head. Like for a unit with this unique support mechanic and provides defense shred and is being touted as like a future-proof and universal support, but there's really no characters in the game currently that utilize, or you know what I'm saying? Like it's the maybes. It's like the deductions and the maybes that it will come in the future, but it doesn't exist currently, and we don't have any knowledge of anything that's coming now. So of anything concrete that's actually coming. So again, I know it's a different game, but that situation just led me to not give a gacha company credit for these sorts of things, unless again it's in the game or it's confirmed to be actually coming. And look, right, so when they talk about the Chisa being the SK of negative statuses, I do think there's some plausibility to this. I think the best case for Chisa's versatility is the 30% defense ignore that she has. And also I mentioned in the wording of her outro that rather than just applying to like Havoc Bane or something, it applies, or rather than just being like Arrow Erosion or Havoc Bane, it says all negative statuses, and even specifically says Electro Rage. But that could also just be like a red herring. But so with that being said, I can see why Brax and Cabinets and other people will compare this to Shorekeeper's crit buffs. The same way that Shorekeeper can basically slot in as a third to many pairs, such as like the Zani Phoebe team, the Augusta Yuna team, Camella, Sanhua, Shorekeeper, right? She can fit into all of those, right? Any character that is dealing crit damage. But at the same time, there's also cases of teams like Mono Fusion with Lupa, Chongli, Brandt. There's the Echo damage teams with Frolova, Chiwen, Cantarella that show that not every team will have SK as like a desirable third or a best in slot third. And Kuro could honestly keep designing teams in sets of 3 because I wouldn't put it past them, because they didn't really get any pushback on the designing of teams in pairs. It clearly worked out a lot better for them in terms of revenue. So they could essentially design like a DPS, sub DPS support characters for each gimmick. And then Chisa would essentially have her place as in the Cardathea team, providing the like necessary functionality and like the defense ignore, and then in like a Havoc Bane team probably. Again, at the end of the day, defense ignore is a universal thing that many characters can take advantage of. And then even going back to this negative status page, for example, if you look at what's written for Spectral Frazzle here, it says that the damage inflicted depends on Resonator level, enemy's defense and res, and the number of stacks. It is not influenced by Resonator attack, crit rate, and other factors. With that being said, defense ignore could be one of the only ways that you can buff these kinds of damage if like attack and crit and all that stuff doesn't actually matter. You know, I just have like a certain feeling that it doesn't seem as plausible they'd go in the direction of these negative statuses dealing damage, because it was never really baked into the foundation of WoW's combat system. Like if you look at like Genshin, HSR, and ZZZ, they had the elemental mastery, break effect, and anomaly proficiency like baked in from the very beginning, so you could actually get those stats on characters to increase damage related to those gimmicks. But if something like attack, crit, other factors like damage bonus doesn't impact negative status's damage, then like what stats are you going to put on your negative status character, right? Like, you know, if damage bonus and attack and crit doesn't work, and that's everything that we basically have, the only option really then is maybe defense ignore. So then Chisa is the only option, or, you know, so there's just questions. I think there's nuance to it with that, right? And then lastly, if you look at like Frolova's team, how it's grown to be best with Cantarella and Shiwen, there's precedent for these kinds of niche mechanics, like how Frolova wants the usage of an echo skill that a general support like Shorekeeper and Chisa can't provide. So if they choose to, they could definitely go in the route of more niche mechanics and stray away from needing universal support. It's just, again, like the calling of, I think, Chisa to be the Shorekeeper of negative statuses, it exists in this realm of maybes and deductions, and, you know, and there's factors that support that deduction, and I think there's also factors that kind of take away from that deduction, and I'm just trying to give the full picture. You know, with all that being said, you know, I respect people like Brax and Cabinets a lot. They've been doing this a lot longer than I have, and you know, sometimes I know to defer to people with like more experience than me, but I've kind of tried to just like lay out all of my logic and evidence and thought process here. So if you disagree, if you think I'm wrong, I'm open to being wrong on this. Just, you know, let me know in the comments or whatever. You can like roast me in the comments. I think the point of this whole video and the spiel is not to necessarily declare one way or another whether Chisa will be universal or not, but kind of to counterbalance the hype, right? So that people can like make an informed decision on their pools. And I think at the end of the day in gacha games, I usually fall back on the sage advice of waiting for reruns in situations like this, because if it turns out that you really want her because there's some other characters that you really like and they want Chisa, then you can safely secure her, because again, even if it's the case that characters come out that you want, that want her, then we don't even know who those characters are. You might not like their visuals, their designs, their play styles, the story, etc., enough to actually pull them and play them. And I think it usually just feels better to get a character for a specific concrete reason than to pool a character and just kind of pray that future characters come out that justify that, and also that you'll even like those characters in the first place. And I think that goes doubly for like free-to-play light spenders who like have to pick and choose who they're actually getting and skipping and things like that. Okay, yeah, okay, so that's basically all I had to say. You know, have fun playing Chisa and WoA 2.8. Okay, I'm just gonna go now. Okay, bye. I think that's all I had to say. All right, bye.